So did Condoleezza Rice the next year. In fact, Cheney, twice in 10 years, Powell twice, Rice once, within the last 7 years, had admitted that Saddam Hussein had no useful weapons of mass destruction and posed no threat to the US or Israel. Within months of the last of those announcements, the US policy flip-flopped 180 degrees. All of a sudden, weapons of mass destruction, which were dismissed as nonsense, which were openly acknowledged to be non-existent, were now asserted to be facts. Why would the US do this? What caused the United States to have such a complete change of understanding? Because no new information had come forward to change the previous assessments, which were correct and have been shown to be correct. Well, the only interested party, the only country interested in bombing Iraq was Israel, for two reasons. Well, three reasons, actually. Iraq has a lot of oil. Israel needs oil. Iraq has a lot of water. The Tigris and the Euphrates are within the ambit of what is called the maximalist Zionist claim on Middle Eastern land, from the Nile to the Euphrates. It's also the case that Saddam Hussein was one of the few Arab leaders courageous enough to stand up and defend the Palestinians against the repression and the sadism of the Israeli state. The occupation is to this day illegal, but it's hard to find any outlet in the media willing to say this. So Saddam Hussein was a political problem and also the head of a country that was the capital of the Arab world, culturally speaking. Baghdad was a great center of learning, and Hussein had a good army. But armies in the Middle East are not something Israel wants on its doorstep. Israel wants to have complete military superiority over the region. And so we had a provocation to bomb Iraq. It wasn't just Bush, though. Throughout the 1990s, Iraq was starved under more illegal, no-fly zones and sanctions regimes, which did nothing but starve Iraqi children and other people. Iraq has never posed a threat to anyone, militarily speaking. The Saudis were scared because they didn't like the idea of an secular Arab regime having weapons on its border, but that's their problem. It was not justified to starve a nation just because some countries were uncomfortable with Hussein. I mean, Hussein was an American ally, to all intents and purposes. He attacked Iran after being goaded by the US. The Iran-Iraq war started because the US pushed Hussein to attack Iran around the Shatt al-Arab waterway in the south. And then Saddam Hussein took the American bait and invaded Kuwait, an excuse for H.W. Bush, to put military into Saudi Arabia to secure oil. Now, if you want to ask why on earth the US would attack Iraq, you've got me, because Iraq posed no threat to the United States. It was not in the United States' interest to bomb Iraq. Why else do it? Again, we have to understand that the United States government, especially since Clinton, has been populated by people who owe more of an allegiance to Israel than to the United States itself. To this day, there are people in the American government who are citizens of Israel. And to have a dual citizen formally policy really brings up questions of duplicity, treason, the very sort of concerns that Jews had before 1967. But these don't matter anymore. It is impossible to believe that a republic could commit suicide by passing the Patriot Act. But it makes more sense to believe that Israel, the United States Congress, is not in control of itself. The people making policy would rather serve Israel than serve their own public. I mean, why else would George W. Bush veto a bill for $30 billion for child insurance, yet write a blank check to bomb Arabs into oblivion? Why terrorize and torture people for no good purpose? I mean, if you want Iraq to supply oil, you don't make the climate so untenable that oil becomes impossible to export. there is direct contradiction between traditional oil policy, as practiced up until the mid-'80s, and oil policy under Bush. And it's important to realize that if we're going to have a discussion about what happened on September the 11th and other such things, we have to look at who benefited from it. The Patriot Act, in my view, represents the culminating act of the fascist coup d'etat that happened in 1980. Now, it was a coup d'etat that happened with the willingness and support of the American public. Because after all, if the liberal Eastern establishment could bring the country to such disgrace in Vietnam, then perhaps it's time we put our faith in people who didn't really think for a living. Put our faith in people who thought of religion, people who told us what we wanted to hear, people who were less intellectual than they were jingoistic and rah-rah, energetic Americans. Ronald Reagan had no business being president, but he spoke to the need of Americans to feel good about themselves. Because both the Republicans and Democrats had been so irredeemably tainted by the war. The Gulf of Tonkin resolution tainted the Johnson administration. The secret bombing of Cambodia and the Watergate cover-up destroyed the Republican credibility. And so they put their faith in people who told them what they wanted to hear, and essentially consigned the country to people who did not know what they were doing and had objectives other than that served the interests of the American people. I mean, to this day, the United States has something called the Strategic Oil Reserve Agreement with Israel, under which it will guarantee to supply Israel with oil in the event of a crisis, even to the extent of denying oil to its own people. The United States has been humiliated, abused, disgraced, internationally and domestically, as it moves to support Israel in whatever it does. And it is impossible to think that this is being done willingly, that the United States is the same country that existed in the 1960s and 70s. The only possible thing that we can conclude is that the United States has been under Israeli occupation to all intents and purposes. I think that's hilarious. Well, okay.
Nothing to do with the direction of the American industrial complex?
I'll be finished in a minute. The only way to understand the last 8 years is that it's a culmination of a number of things that happened in the United States that I articulate in my book here, and shows how the United States slowly and quite clearly allowed itself to be occupied and humiliated by a lobby that had at its primary interest the interests of another government. Because a lot of people will argue that, well, the United States is the strongest country in the world. Nobody can push the United States around. Well, if you look at the people who run the United States, the military-industrial complex is a very good example. The interplay between them and the Israel lobby is very, very close. And it makes no sense for the United States to murder Arabs en masse. It makes no sense for the United States to repudiate its own principles and declare war on its own citizens. The only way we can make sense of this is that the people in Washington are serving another government, that we have essentially a treasonous government. And in fact, if you know how both Bush stole the last 2 elections, was not legitimately elected. We have to look at the sort of gangsterism that we most commonly associate with the mafia or some other sort of organized crime. There is no other way to explain the United States from a rational point of view. It cannot be done. There is no rational explanation for the United States' behavior. We must assume an irrational frame of reference. We must assume that the United States we see and the United States that really exists are quite 2 separate things. And if we do that, and we look at the events of September the 11th and how that happened, and the people who were responsible for it, we end up with conclusions that the United States has been dominated by interest groups that put the interests of America behind that of Israel. I have a number of other things I could say, but I don't want to speak for too much longer, and I will give the floor over to questions.